Hello, everyone. My name is Leske, and I'm very grateful to HigherEdJobs for asking me to host this webinar for you today. I have been an executive search consultant in higher education for over 22 years, and as such have been involved in or supported hundreds of searches for leaders in various positions. And in the process have not only observed leaders in action or people demonstrating leadership behavior, but also have worked alongside some very, very fine leaders, presidents, board members, and other members of various organizations in higher education, public, private, small, large, across the country, and even internationally. So hopefully have learned a few things in the process that I would like to share with you today as you think about yourselves as leaders or are pursuing opportunities to demonstrate leadership, move into leadership roles. What we're going to cover are a few topics. There are many, many different points of view on what leaders actually do and what organizations and search committees expect leaders to do, how they expect them to behave, what they expect them to look like. So we'll talk a little bit about that and whether and how to recognize that in yourself or others. And then we'll move on to talking about how to associate various leadership roles or expectations with competencies and strengths that you may have or that you have developed, and or what to do about any gaps or weaknesses or lack of experience against those position requirements, how to think about them and manage them. We'll talk a little bit about what you might do to build on those strengths and gaps, and then finally how to think about the application and interview process and how you might demonstrate leadership ability, particularly when you may not have the direct experience that an organization is looking for. How do you prepare for roles where you may have some but not all of the experience they're looking for? And hopefully you'll walk away from this webinar with a few tips or pointers on how to pursue that leadership role. So, what do leaders actually do? And how do you know one when you've seen one? And how do you know that you're a leader or have leadership capabilities? Once upon a time, I interviewed a candidate whose name I have forgotten, and I apologize. Perhaps he's here watching this webinar and will recognize this, but he shared with me a list of leadership responsibilities that he's been able to remember and retain over time, as have I, because it's a small list and it's easy to remember. What leaders actually do, and as a preface to this, how is a leader different from a manager? What is the difference between management and leadership? There are hundreds and thousands of books written on this subject, more than there are stars in the sky, and many, many different theories, but a few consistent themes have emerged. And one of which is the difference between a leader and a manager is that a leader is charged with coping with change and or is often described as strategic. And the definition of strategic is the ability to plan towards advantage or towards an end. Strategic is planning towards advantage. Whereas managers, instead of coping as much with change, they cope with the complexity and manage the tactics or implement tactics in order to make order out of that complexity and enable leaders to gain that advantage. So management is about tactics and complexity. Leadership is about change and strategy. So if we think about that as we look at this slide, in order for a leader to fulfill that characteristic or characterization as strategic, a leader must set a horizon, a goal, a direction. Sometimes that's done with others, but the leader is still charged with making sure that that direction is pursued and the horizon is reached, or at least attempted. And then helping people weigh the pluses and minuses of pursuing that direction, the risk. What risks are we taking, and how do we manage that as we pursue that direction? Secondly, a leader is responsible, or should be responsible, for assuring that there are resources lined up to achieve that goal. And that's a wide range of resources, from physical to intellectual. Relationships, managing the relationships necessary to achieve strategic advantage. And those relationships could be external or internal. They could be organizational or personal. What barriers do they represent, or what leverage do they represent in moving the organization forward? That's the leader's responsibility to figure that out and manage those relationships. Finally, a leader's responsibility is to passionately advocate for the organization, its mission, and for the people or the beneficiaries of that organization, and why it's important. It's a modeling a set of values or behaviors. So if we can remember these four things about the responsibilities of leadership as we move forward through this presentation, many of the things that I'll be talking about you can tie back to these four responsibilities. Some other well-known quotes about leadership that we can think about further: that leaders are often invisible, that the evidence in some cultures and some organizations of strong leadership is that that things happen almost invisibly, that people feel that they accomplished things themselves, that everyone in the organization feels that they had a part in it. That everyone in the organization feels like they have been made better, or as a result, that they've sort of extended themselves beyond what they even thought was possible. And in many ways, good leaders ensure that the institution is focused on the right things, the values and behaviors that the organization agreed to, either through its mission statement or vision statement, or more informal ways. In my experience, people, search committees, clients expect leaders almost to do the impossible, to do everything and anything. Everything from meeting expectations determined internally or externally, to managing change, we talked about risk earlier. There's an enormous amount of external scrutiny right now on our organizations about how we manage our resources and whether we're doing that effectively or efficiently, particularly in light of cost. Staying calm when things get really crazy. The crazier things get, the calmer you have to be. But you also, as a leader, I think people expect leaders to be approachable and willing to roll up their sleeves and do whatever is needed to be done. Including the old adage, never ask anyone to do what you wouldn't do yourself. I think we have found, certainly at Witt Kieffer, that there are some universal traits in leaders, but that not all leaders are alike, and not all leadership traits or skills are appropriate for various organizations at different points in time. One of the books that I have listed at the end in the bibliography, which is a well-known reference for people who are studying leadership, is by Lee Ballman and Terrence Deal, called Reframing Organizations. And their fundamental argument is that there are 4 different ways to evaluate organizations, and they include structurally, the sort of the organizational aspect of the institution, human resources, or the people, what kinds of people are within an organization, the political frame of the organization, and or the symbolic frame, organizations as cultures or symbols. And so the affiliated premise is that different leaders can approach organizations from these frames or through these frames to think about how they manage change or move those organizations towards strategic advantage through either looking at organizational aspects or repositioning the institution within in terms of visibility, marketing, branding, politics, or thinking about the people within the organization. So not all leaders are alike, but there are some basic traits and or competencies that you see in leaders across a range of sectors, from higher education to the corporate world and so on. And we've done a study on these leadership traits in higher education, and where we see some commonalities and differences. And one of the interesting pieces that we measured were values, whether all leaders across all sectors share the same values. And we did. We found some interesting similarities and differences. In this particular slide, these are the value sets that we measure in our testing. We tested a number of higher education leaders, established leaders, against U.S. executives overall, and found some that in terms of affiliation, which is the valuing other people, in terms of power, which is really a desire for success, not a desire necessarily for control, but is a desire for success and accomplishment, recognition, visibility. In higher education, that would be related to quality, recognition of quality. Science, which is an interest in learning more, always learning. Security is, those are motives that reflect a desire for predictability and order and stability and sustainability. And then tradition, which is respect for values, deeply held values around the history and or mission of an organization. Those are similar across all executives, including higher education. Where we see differences in higher education leaders are in how highly leaders value arts, literature, humanities. So many of the arts and sciences aspects of being part of a higher education institution. Altruistic values or motives, which are all about the welfare of others, which is consistent with our higher education mission. And then, so those are higher than U.S. executives. Where they tend to be lower than executives overall is in how highly leaders in higher education value the financial and business aspects of running these organizations. This is an interesting difference today as we think about how higher education is changing and the dynamic landscape. We're probably going to see that big difference shift a little bit in the future. And then hedonism is really our motives that reflect personal gratification. And so we see a little bit less of that in higher education executives, probably reflected by the fact that salaries and benefits and personal wealth accumulation are lower, if at all, in higher education. And so we don't see as much of that. So those are some interesting traits that we see across the United States. This next slide begins a discussion of the typical job description that we've seen in higher education. So this set of traits or criteria was pulled from an actual job description that Witt Kieffer prepared with the help of one of its clients in academic medicine, and it's for a executive vice president type position. And when people were submitting questions about this webinar, several of them said, how do I get a leadership role without experience? Everybody wants evidence of experience. Well, here it is at the top of this list, experience in a senior leadership position. Most of these job descriptions are pretty vague on this area. And what we try to help our clients see is that experience is good, but potential could also be good as long as the competencies are there. But this is a fact of life, so we often see this, so you have to be prepared to think about that or mitigate it in an interview or resume that you might be sharing. Here we have, relative to a prior slide, evidence of the business skills now needed in these organizations. They're becoming more complex, and trustees and others are looking for these kinds of competencies. It's an interesting side note here why faculty relations and operations are in the same sentence, which I find interesting, but more on that some other time. Continuing with the job description, more track record, evidence, but here we see ability. Track record, evidence indicating ability to manage change effectively. So it's possible in some of these jobs, if you don't have evidence, to demonstrate ability. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Here we have revenue and budget. Revenue is a big deal in many of our organizations now, with federal cutbacks, state funding dropping, families, it's harder and harder for families to pay full price. Many of our organizations are looking for people who have the ability to find new sources of revenue or to think about their organizations in terms of revenue or net revenue, which is relatively new to higher education versus most other industries. Continuing with expectations, here we have track records of team building, developing a high performance team, the environment, the ability to think in terms of a vision, and working across the organization to communicate and get people aligned behind that vision. That's back to those four things, those four responsibilities of a leader. Aligning resources. Continuing, we look at style now, personal and professional qualities. So here we have communication style, the ability to relate to people and build trust and get buy-in and help people resolve issues so that the organization continues moving forward towards that horizon. This is the last slide on this particular list. Communication skills. Lots of people describe leaders in positive terms as being transparent communicators. If we look at this top criteria, there's the word financial there. Even if we just take out financial, this is a very common expectation of leaders today. The ability to communicate and succinctly present complex issues. Translation. Speaking in common English, making sure that everyone over and over and over hears the message and understands in many ways the data from which you're working. They're helping people interpret the data from which you're working. And then consistent with that is the ability to use analytical tools, whether this leader does it or has people who can do it for them. This is incredibly important today. The ability to use metrics and data to move forward. So we talked a lot about what leaders do or what they're expected to do, or what committees and clients are looking for in leaders. And now I want to talk a little bit about how do you know you've got it? How do you know that you have these traits? Maybe people have told you what you're good at. Maybe you've had performance reviews where you have learned how others perceive you. Maybe you have a very good sense of self-analysis. There are other external tools that you can use, including 360-degree reviews, which I've had done myself several times, and they're extremely helpful. Really useful in understanding what you're good at and where you can grow. This graphic on the side is a sample of a competency assessment tool that we use at Witt Kieffer that shows some of the strengths and competencies that we measure on the left-hand column. So those are some of the things that you would want to be looking for in a 360-degree review. Myers-Briggs or other assessment tools can often do this, but you probably want to make sure that that tool is on the professional competency side as opposed to just personality. Sometimes your mentor or your colleagues can give you very valuable information. If you've ever used someone to serve as a reference, you should ask them what they're going to say about you when they're called as a reference, and you can learn from that as well what you're good at and where you might have a gap or a weakness. But doing this is a wonderful exercise if you have an opportunity to get sort of more hard information about what you're good at. The next slide is one of the traits that people are always looking for, or say they're looking for in our work, is emotional intelligence. Well, what is emotional intelligence, and how do we measure it, and how do you know you have it? Emotional intelligence in general is the ability to understand yourself. It is an outgrowth of a self-examined life, one in which you are looking at yourself. You're aware of your behaviors, your values, your style, and its impact on others or impact on situations or dynamics. This is one of the most important traits that search committees and clients look for, but one that they're probably least able to analyze or evaluate in the kind of settings that you may find yourself in. But if you can check the boxes on this list, or most of the boxes on this list, or at least be aware of these boxes, and then think about how you demonstrate that in your current work, in your daily life, and or in job situations, this is generally one of the most important traits that people are looking for in leaders, the ability to recognize how you impact others. So what are some of the strengths that might be revealed in an analysis of an assessment or in feedback from your colleagues or in performance reviews? Here's some examples on the left in the column. And these are strengths that are often sought in leaders, and we saw in our job description a few minutes ago. Ability to develop teams, interpersonal skills, big picture thinker. If you've been told that you have these strengths and you're continuing to seek leadership roles, then on the right-hand column are the areas where you should be looking at how to match your strengths for your next position or your next leadership role. So if, for instance, you're a big picture, you've been told you're a big picture thinker, then the types of things that would really build on your strengths are things that would engage you in strategic planning, visioning, or setting direction. If you have many people who approach leadership positions, and many of our clients want people who can raise money, fundraisers now, back to revenue generation. So if you have strong interpersonal skills, if you're really curious about what makes other human beings tick, if you like listening to people's stories and and enjoy bringing what is meaningful to them to the surface, then fundraising is a great activity for you, because it really is about engaging other people in imagining a future and what their role can be in it. And so here are areas that leaders, on the right-hand column, this is where leaders are expected to perform. And if you have these strengths on the right, you can build on those strengths to be really good at those activities that leaders are expected to do. Some additional strengths that leaders are expected to demonstrate are the ability to be adaptable, to mentor others, to provide feedback, build consensus. One of the most interesting traits is up in the upper left-hand corner, this notion of generating informal power, which is hard to measure, but if you have a reputation as a go-to person in your organization, it's probably because you have built informal power, a profile as someone who not only can get things done, but can make sure that things are done for you. This is not about manipulating or name dropping or political maneuvering. It's really pretty simple. If, for example, someone comes to you and says, I have this problem, and you say, gee, have you thought about this solution? Let me find you this book, or let me share my space, or let me do this or that to help you. It's a very simple, informal exchange that builds a relationship and trust with another person. So the next time they have a problem, or someone else has a problem, they say, you should go talk to so-and-so. They really helped me out when I had a similar issue. They might have some good ideas for you. This is a really important ability, and often one that goes unnamed when we're talking about strengths and what makes leaders really productive, and what and how other people perceive leaders. So Billie Jean King, said once when she was coaching young tennis players that to gain real advantage as a tennis player, instead of trying to get all of your skills to the same level, build on what you're very, very good at and use those strengths to advantage, and get the weaknesses to the point where they're not in your way. So instead of thinking always about how to be good at everything, how can you get the weaknesses to a point where they're adequate, that you have an adequate skill set there and they're not a liability? So on the left-hand side in this column, we have a list of sample weaknesses that search committees and clients often pick up during interviews or when reviewing materials of candidates. These are common and have appeared in many of our searches. They don't pay enough attention to details. I didn't get enough detail during that interview. I didn't hear enough granular information. This person interrupted too much. I don't see any supervisory experience or didn't hear any evidence of their having managed a team. These are typical weaknesses or gaps. And back to that expectation earlier in an earlier list that you have to demonstrate direct experience. If you don't have direct experience, how can you possibly gain it? It's a chicken and an egg issue. So here's some thoughts and ideas on the right on how to get those weaknesses or gaps to a point where they're not in your way, or that you can move them to the side and again, build on your strengths. So if you're in a position, for example, where you have lack of line management or supervisory experience, and the next job that you want or the next position that you want either requires it or they're insisting that there be evidence of the ability, one way to gain that ability is to put yourself in positions where you have to recruit, retain, evaluate, motivate, supervise, follow up on other people. If they don't report to you directly, they could be part of a committee or a new initiative or program. Another option is instead of moving up first, you move across. Gain, if you're a frontline major gift officer and you want supervisory experience, volunteer to run the annual fund and 3 or 4 staff members. If you're an associate vice president with no supervisory experience, when someone retires or moves on or is ill, volunteer to serve in that role, even if it's not in your area, even if it's somewhere else. That will get you experience. So these are some ways to gain experience. Change management experiences is an interesting challenge. Shadowing or partnering or working alongside leaders who are charged with managing change or implementing change is one way to do that. Another is to apply for and participate in either internal fellowships within your organization or through ACE or the ASCU Millennium Institute. Those are some examples of how to do that. Fundamentally, there may be, through your 360 review, you may have found that you have certain gaps or weaknesses, as I have in my life, and coaching to learn new behaviors is helpful. I have a sign on my desk to stop doing these 3 things that I've been told I do too much, and sometimes that's helpful. So different tricks and coaching to learn new behaviors doesn't mean that they will stop. That weaknesses or things like interrupting will stop, but at least you will learn how to move it into the not a problem category as opposed to a weakness. So our next slide, we're going to move into how do you demonstrate leadership ability as a candidate. So whether it's internally or externally, we have 2 ways to do it. One is in writing through evidence in a cover letter or a resume. And the other is through actually modeling the behavior when you're interacting with others, either currently in your current organization or with search committees or potential new employers. And so how we do it through evidence is through actual experience, but also examples, and through interaction, what you put in writing, and then how you interact with people face to face. So, evidence. We heard a little bit earlier about having to demonstrate direct experience. Often it's a real conundrum when you haven't got it. But if you do your research and understand the job thoroughly, what I have seen is that candidates can suspend disbelief that they haven't had enough haven't had enough experience by modeling or demonstrating a good understanding of the job, and then drawing potential employers' attention to your competency, strengths, and how you've built up enough competency to tackle the job at hand. So we start out with a cover letter and the resume. How do you demonstrate this through evidence? Well, first of all, you demonstrate it through your ability to set the horizon and the vision. You have in a cover letter only to cover 3 items. This is all that people care about, these 3 items. The first is, why are you interested in us? Why are you interested in this organization or this position? That's your opportunity to do your 30-second elevator speech in writing and set a vision or a tone or excitement about the organization. What is it that makes it so exciting to you? The second is, what is your understanding of the job, and how have you prepared yourself for it? It's not a narrative regurgitation of your CV. It is drawing the reader's attention to the 2 or 3 things that you have done that have prepared you to take on this next step. And those are either specific, relevant examples of direct experience or descriptions of how you've developed the competency needed to do that job. If you understand what leaders are supposed to do and what this leadership role is about, you can talk about how for example, your decision-making ability has evolved from a personal, isolated, activity to how you engage others in collecting the information you need to make the decision, how you communicate that decision, and how you implement it, particularly with people who don't report to you. That is specific, relevant example of a leader-like activity, and you draw the reader's attention to that. The third thing that people look for in these written materials are your values. And we talked earlier about those values. What drives you and motivates you? And why is that important? Because people are looking for fit. And in leaders, they want to make sure that their leader shares the same values that they have, either as part of their mission or vision or purpose. And so that's everything from how often you mention students, for example, in the letter, or academic quality, or research, or how often you talk about I versus we, or acknowledge others' achievements. So your writing in this cover letter and this resume demonstrates and portrays you as a human being, and people look for that. By the way, the cover letter is a case statement. It's a marketing statement. So it should be based on reflection and research and reflection, or distillation. It should not be a narrative compilation of everything you've ever done. People can find that in your resume. The resume should have the quantitative information, whereas the cover letter is making the case for you as their next leader. The other part of demonstrating leadership behaviors when you're interacting with people. The cover letter is a form of interaction. So how well you think about what your purpose is, and the people with your audience will be reflected in that letter, and that's a form of interaction. That letter and or your personal interactions on phone or in person should demonstrate a level of enthusiasm and interest in this potential position, and that should be based on a lot of research, not name dropping, not spewing out facts, but really developing as much of a deep understanding as you can about this organization beforehand. Think about the 3 or 4 competencies that you want to make sure that you demonstrate or communicate. You know what your strengths are. Build on those strengths. Make sure that you bring them to the surface when you interact with people. One thing I've observed over time is that in interacting with people, in interviewing for the job in particular, many candidates misread the situation as one where they're supposed to get the answers right. This is sort of like a dissertation defense. It's not a dissertation defense. It's not a congressional subcommittee interview. It is an audition. You are modeling the behavior. People are imagining you in the role for the first time when they see you at that table. Your ability to, in many ways, facilitate their decision, which is, do we want to spend more time with this person? Your ability to facilitate that decision is demonstrated in the room. They are looking at you as a facilitator, leader, meeting runner. All of those behaviors should be evident as you engage with this group of people. So your ability to get them to do some talking, your ability to listen to what they're saying, is front and center. That's really what's being evaluated. Maya Angelou is the one who said, at the end of the day, it's not what you said that's important. It's how people felt when they listened and heard you. Some tried and true interview techniques that I've observed over the years. Think ahead about the job, the expectations, and bring your stories, your narrative, your examples with you. So if you expect them to ask you questions about your management style, behavior, and or experience, be prepared to answer those questions with examples that you've thought about ahead of time. It's through narrative that we establish relationships. That's what they will remember. The objective of an interview and an interaction on both sides is to answer the question, do I want to spend more time with this person? So modeling that behavior, engaging people, and becoming one half of that two-way relationship is important. That's where your leadership ability is demonstrated. Don't talk for more than 5 minutes when you answer a question, because they have lots more questions. And if you talk for more than 5 minutes, you're not demonstrating good listening behavior. People will accuse you of being more interested in listening to yourself than to others. So remember that committees, clients, potential employers have an agenda. So think before you speak and think about what you want to say first. And then remember that it's really to get a conversation going, so that at the end of the interview, when it's your turn to ask questions, make sure that you ask them questions that will get them to do the talking. Because again, that's what you're there for, to lead, not be listened to. And we learned earlier, that's what leaders do. They listen. A president, I know, I asked her recently what she thought was important in leaders. And her answer was she thought experience was overrated. She herself had been appointed to the role of president without a great deal of line management experience, which is the standard. Many people say must have line management experience, and she herself was appointed without much to speak of, and had a very successful presidency. It's really a set of skills and competencies that make good leaders. And if, as we all know, if you're thrown in over your head to various situations, you often learn more than if you prepare. Being in the deep end of the pool teaches you a lot about how to swim, as long as you have the basics to work with. So if you've been told in your life that you have these traits, intelligence, judgment, sense of humor, drive, you probably have what it takes to be a leader. And it's really all about understanding what your real strengths are, taking advantage of those, making sure that any weaknesses that you do have are not impediments to success. As John F. Kennedy said, leadership is not an end in itself. It is a learning process. And as long as you're transparent and open and engage others in it, and you will be a fine leader one day. And we thank you. We thank you very much for taking the time to listen, and wish you all the very, very best in your professional goals and aspirations. There's a short list of reading material at the end here, things that I found useful in the past. I wish you luck, and thank you, and have a wonderful day.